13, chapter 16. On the morning of the 8th day of the opening, the royal yacht set off from the island bound for the secret cove. Not only was the Queen aboard, but the King and several of the courtiers, for he understood now that the Queen had to get as close as she could to the place where the Prince would appear, if he appeared at all. 2 days had passed since the cheerful message from the witch, and still there was no sign of their son. All along the King had tried to comfort his wife, but now even he was finding it hard to be brave. Down below a special cabin had been prepared for the wailing nurses. They had begged to be allowed to come along, but since they hadn't washed for 9 years, they had to be kept well away from the other passengers. With them had come a new crate of bananas, because the first batch had become overripe, and the Queen had managed a smile as she saw it carried aboard, because it meant the triplets at least still hoped. As the royal yacht drew out of the harbour, a second and much larger boat pulled up its anchors ready to follow. This was a ship chartered by people on the island who could not fit onto the King's yacht, but who also wanted to be there for the last day of the opening. Most of them were people who cared very much about the little prince, and longed for him to be brought back safely, even now at the 11th hour. But some, just a few, were peevish grumblers, people who wanted to gloat over the old wizard and the loopy fay and the conceited little hag when they came back in disgrace. And there was always such people, even in the most beautiful and best ruled places, who just wanted an outing and a chance to gawp at whatever was going to happen, whether it was good or bad. The royal yacht skimmed over the waves, the charter boat followed more slowly. In their cabin the nurses wailed and tried to think of ways of punishing themselves, but not for long, because they became seasick, and no one can think of a worse punishment than that. The Queen would not go below. She stood leaning over the rails, her long hair whipped by the wind, and over again she said, "Dear God, please let him come, please let him come. I will never do anything bad again if only you let him come." The poor Queen. She never had done anything bad. She was not that sort of person. They'd been at sea for only a short time when something happened. The sky darkened, a black thundercloud moved in from the west, and a few drops of rain fell on the deck. Or was it rain? The sailors who had been below hurried up the ladders, preparing for a storm. The gulls flew off with cries of alarm. The dolphins dived. It was not a storm, though, and the swirling blackness was not a cloud. The sky yelpers came first, a pack of baying, saucer-eyed dogs racing overhead, dropping their spittle on the deck where it hissed and sizzled and broke into little tongues of flames where the sailors stamped it out. But it was the harpies which made the Queen sway, and the King ran to her side. They flew in formation like geese, with Mrs. Smith at the head and the others in a V-shape behind her. Miss Green, Miss Brown, Miss Jones and Miss Witherspoon. Their handbags dangled from their arms. Their vanished talons hung down from their crimp-like bloomers, and their unspeakable stench beat against the clean, salty air of the sea. From the charter ship, a cheer went up. These were the real rescuers, the proper ones, and about time too. The King and Queen had waited to the last possible moment before sending in these frightful women, and there were those who thought they had delayed too long. The harpies flew on, the dogs racing before them. In an hour they would be through the gump. The Queen's knuckles whitened on the rail, but she would not faint. She would bear it. There was nothing else to do, my dear. You know that, said the King. The Queen nodded. She did know it. There were 24 hours left, only one day. These ghastly creatures were her only hope. Ben lay on the floor of the summer house, his head pillowed on the wizard's rolled-up cloak. His eyes were closed. His face, in the light of the candles, was deathly pale. Since Hans had carried him out of the Astor, he had not stirred. Gertie sat beside him, holding his hand. She had rubbed healing ointment onto his scalp. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was closing, but the deeper hurt, the damage of his brain, was beyond her power to heal. And if he never came round again, if he lived forever in a coma, or if he died, but no one could bear to think of that. Course sat still as stone in the folding chair. He was shivering, but they hadn't been able to stop him giving his cloak to Ben. I am too old, he thought. I have failed in my mission and brought harm to a brave child, the bravest child I shall ever see. Hans was crouched on the steps. His fern seed was gone blotchy, and every so often a moan escaped him. "Oi," murmured the giant. "Oi." If he had followed Ben at once into the dining room instead of waiting by the prince, he could have prevented this dreadful accident, and he knew that he would never forgive himself. The manhole cover on the path now lifted slowly, and the flodger climbed out. still in his working clothes. "Any news?" he asked. "Has he come round?" The wizard shook his head and the plodger sighed and made his way back into the sewer. Millicent was going to be dreadfully upset. It was well past midnight. In Trottle Towers the servants slept, believing that Ben had already been taken to his new home. The ghost had come to stand round Ben as he lay unstirring, and then gone back to guarding of the gump. It was amazing how many people had come to ask after Ben. People who should scarcely even known the boy. Wizards and witches, the banshee who had worked in the laundry room of the Astor, the flower fairy who'd pinched Mrs. Trottle on the nose. It was extraordinary how many people cared. It was the last day of their opening. They'd expected to be back on the island by now, but no one even thought of leaving. Ben had helped them from the first moment. They had seen him cleaning shoes in the basement of Trottle Towers. He had seemed at once to belong to them. Not one of the rescuers dreamt of abandoning him. Odge was not with the others as they clustered round Ben. She had gone off by herself and was sitting by the edge of the lake, wrapped in her long black hair. Ben was going to die. Odge was sure of it. "And it's my fault," she said aloud. "I brought the Mistmaker, and it was because he went to save him that Ben was hurt." The Mistmaker lay beside Ben now. Odge had been able to snatch him up when the ogre brought Ben out of the dining room. If Ben woke, he would see the little animal at once and know that he was all right. But he wouldn't wake. No one could lie there so white and still and not be at death's door. And if Ben died, nothing would go right ever again. She could grow an extra toe, she could grow a whole crop of extra toes, she could learn to cough frogs, and none of it would be any use. Only yesterday her great aunt had taught her that striking people with boldness fell. But what did that matter now? Hags don't cry. Odge knew that, but nothing now could stop her tears. Then suddenly she lifted her head. Something had happened. Something horrible. An evil stench spread slowly over the grass and crept through the branches of the trees. The roosting birds flew upwards as cries of alarm. A cloud passed over the moon. Running back to warn the others, she saw that they had risen to their feet and were staring at the sky. The smell grew worse. A mouse in the bushes squealed in terror. A needle of ice pierced the warmth of the summer night. And then she came. Her rancid wings fluttered once, twice, and were folded as she came to land. Her handbag dangled from her arm. The frill round the bottom of her bloomers, hugging her scaly legs, was like the ruff on a poisonous lizard. "Well, well," sneered Mrs. Smith. "Quite a cosy little family party, I see." She opened her handbag to take out her powder puff, and the rescuers fell back. The smell of a harpy's face powder is one of the most dreaded smells in the world. One might think that people who had fallen down on their job so completely would at least show some sign of being sorry. No one spoke. The nail polish on the harpy's ghastly talons, the loathsome hairspray on her permed hair, were making them feel dizzy and sick. Candles, flowers, giants in embroidered braces. "Phew," said Mrs. Smith. She put her claws on Gerkie's begonia and tore it out of the ground. "Well, you know why I'm here. To tell you you're finished, demoted, kaput, off the job. I don't know if the King and Queen will ever forgive you, but if they've got any sense, they won't. You're failures. You're feeble, pathetic, a disaster, rescuing a kitchen boy and leaving the prince." Still the rescuers said nothing. They were guilty of everything the harpy accused them of, but they had put Ben before the prince. Hans had struggled with himself for a few minutes, but in the end, he and the troll had run back to help Ben and left the true prince of the island in a squelchy heap inside the cake. They had forgotten him. It was as simple as that. And Raymond had come to himself and climbed out, and even now was probably guzzling Knickerbocker glories in his room in the hotel. What's more, they haven't even thought of going back and having another go at getting him out. All they thought about was carrying Ben away to safety. They weren't fit to be rescuers. The harpy was right. "The ghost told me what happened," said Mrs. Smith. "But if I was the King and Queen, I'd know what to do with you. All the fuss about a common servant boy." "He's not a common servant boy. He's Ben," raged Odge, and took a step backwards as the harpy lifted her dreadful claw and sharpened it once, twice, 3 times against the step. "Well, the most useful thing you can do now is keep out of our way," Mrs. Smith went on. "Get yourself through the gump and let us finish the job." Gerkie put her hand to her heart. She didn't care for Raymond, but the idea of him being carried away in the talons of Mrs. Smith was too horrible to bear. "How will you operate?" asked the wizard. "That's none of your business. But some of my girls are sussing out the Astor now. There seems to be a helicopter pad." She said no more, but in the distance they could hear the baying of a hellhound and a high screeching voice ordering him to sit. The harpy flew off then, but the evil she had left in the air still lingered. Then, from behind them came a strong young voice. "Goodness," said Ben, sitting up and rubbing his head. "What an absolutely horrible smell."